All right, so we left off talking about how Jesus, he acknowledged and recognized the books of the Old Testament as we have them today. And we just read Luke chapter 24, 44, where Jesus himself said, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms concerning me. And this is basically how the Jews divided their Bible back then, right? Law of Moses is the Torah, right? What they call the Torah. Prophets in Hebrew is Nevi'im. Nevi'im, right? And then the Psalms is actually the first book in the last section that's called the Ketuvim, which is like the writings. Let me show you another slide. They have an abbreviation for this three-part division called Tanakh, right? Tanakh. It's an abbreviation, right? The T-A, I think is related to how Hebrew is spelled. Yes, the Torah became T-A, okay? And the Torah is 5 books. The Nevi'im became N-A, okay? Nevi'im, the prophets, there are 8 books here. It starts with Joshua, then it's Judges, then it's Samuel, then it's Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, finally the 12. Then you have the Ketuvim, which is referring to the writings, 11 books. It starts with Psalms, goes to Proverbs, and then the last book of this section is Chronicles, right? So it's a little bit different from our order in the Christian Bible, but the content is exactly the same. Like Ezra and Nehemiah was 1 book. So when Jesus was saying, all these things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, he's basically referring to the whole Old Testament canon. All of the Old Testament canonical books, right? Which I guess had already existed by the time of Jesus. Did I confuse anybody with this? We okay? Right? Okay, so let's now go back to the previous. Okay. And I know yesterday there were some people who were talking about like the Apocrypha, right? The Apocrypha. Notice that in the New Testament books, Jesus never made any mention of the Apocrypha, even though it existed already by then. What is the Apocrypha? Let me show you another slide. Yeah. Right, there were these books. That were already written by the time of Jesus. These were their titles. And the thing is, Jesus never mentioned these. Okay, so that's one of the primary reasons why we don't think the Apocrypha is part of the scriptures. You could use it for reference, but it's not scriptural for us to make doctrine or apply it to apply it seriously into our lives. For the Roman Catholics, this is part of their canon. This is part of their Bible, okay, for the Roman Catholics. And my understanding is the doctrine of purgatory. You guys know the doctrine? You have heard of purgatory? That comes from one of the verses in the Apocrypha. Okay, yeah. So we don't, it's not exactly written there, but I think they built that concept from a verse in the apocryphal books. And but yeah, we have no such doctrine or concept. So, some people were asking me the other day, like, what about the apocryphal books? Yeah, Jesus never mentioned them, right? Never referred to them. They also were written in Greek, right? They're written in Greek, whereas the Old Testament books are written in Hebrew. So it's like a different period, right? And if you read some of these, the kind of tone is a little bit different from the other books too. So for these reasons and probably others, we don't view the apocryphal books as part of the Bible, part of our scriptures. Does that help answer some questions? Yeah, it's okay. All right, let's go back here. All right, so the Old Testament canon already existed by the time of Jesus. Well, then Jesus, he preached for about 3 years, and then he established the church. And when the church first started, the apostles were bearing witness of Jesus, right? Like we kind of mentioned in Acts 1:8. And they would refer to the Old Testament. They would quote Old Testament scriptures to prove that Jesus is the Christ. When Philip preached to the Ethiopian eunuch, he just preached Jesus to him by using Isaiah 53, right? Okay, so the apostles used the Hebrew scriptures, especially for those that believed in the Hebrew Bible. But eventually, there was a need for some Christian authoritative texts, right? Why? First of all, the apostles began to pass away, right? The actual eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and teachings and miracles, they were disappearing. And then persecution was occurring. Persecution was occurring. So members started to become scattered. And of course, when persecution comes, not only are you scattered, maybe you might start questioning your faith too, right? Like, what do I believe in? And then even if there was no persecution, the church was being established in different parts of the world. And Gentiles, non-Jews, were believing in Jesus. Right? The membership was becoming more and more diverse with time. And with so many different cultures, then the Christians needed to have something to base their teaching, right, and their lifestyle from. And especially like in the Old Testament, you don't really see that much about Gentiles. You do see some, right? But you don't see that much. So a lot of the New Testament writings is addressed to Gentiles, if you think about it. Okay. All right. And then it's also pretty clear, heresy and false teachings, writings, were becoming more prevalent in that time. And especially like 2nd century, 3rd century, there was an ideology called Gnosticism, right? Gnosticism that was especially popular. There's also this guy named Marcion, which I will talk about in a little bit. He had some different teachings. So the Christians wanted to eventually let people know, hey, these are the writings that we base our faith on. Okay. Yeah, so it became increasingly important to clarify what writings were authoritative, what teachings, right, were authoritative and so-called orthodox. Okay, now the hints of this process of writing and then reading out loud and then distributing authoritative writings can already be seen within the New Testament books themselves. Right? Let's first read Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4. Verse 16. Colossians chapter 4, verse 16. Let's go to Vinny. Please read. Okay. So Paul wrote a letter to the church in Colossae. And towards the end of his letter, he said, make sure, when it's read aloud among you, see that it is read aloud also in the church of the Laodiceans. Okay, Laodicea and Colossae were relatively close to each other. So what we can see is that Paul's letters, when he wrote to these churches, they were being read publicly. They were probably copied. Okay, even though you don't see it here, they were probably copied once they received that first original, and then they would pass on the copy to other church locations. Okay, so there were already some text, like Paul's writings, that was being a scripture being read out loud, like back in the synagogues, right? How they would read the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Let's also turn to another verse. Let's go to 2 Peter 3. 2 Peter 3, verse 15. 2 Peter 3, verse 15 and 16. Claire, right? Claire, please read. Okay. Notice the phrasing, right, that Peter used concerning Paul's writings, Paul's epistles. He says that people, unstable and untaught people, they were twisting Paul's writings as they do with the rest of the scriptures. Right? So in Peter's mind, he has already placed Paul's writings on equal footing with the rest of scriptures. Okay? So already before the apostles passed away, there were already these hints of this canonization process, right? Of what was authoritative, what was being approved to be read and distributed amongst the churches. Okay. Now, after many decades, the apostles had passed away. The church, at least historically, was still there. But more and more heresies crept into the church or impacting the Christians. And one of them was a man named Marcion. Okay? He was from a place called Sinope, which I believe is Eastern Europe. Let me just double check that real quick. Okay, I got it wrong. It's in Turkey. southern coast of the Black Sea, northern Turkey. Okay, so he's from that area, and he actually was a Christian in the church, but he later came up with some heretical views, and he was later excommunicated from the church at this time. But he was perhaps the first in the historical record to start to propose a definitive list of authoritative books, right, to base your faith on. And he actually had 11 books in his list. Okay, he had a gospel that was very similar to the Gospel of Luke. And in his view, the 10 Pauline letters were also or 10 of the Pauline letters were authoritative. Like he didn't include 1st and 2nd Timothy nor Titus, okay? But the other 10, he thought this is authoritative, right? So he was kind of the first to kind of do something like that. And since he was excommunicated, right, this, whether directly or indirectly, eventually forced Christians to consider which texts were authoritative, were canonical, and why. Okay, and there's a lot of details that I'm going to just skip over. But basically, over the next 2 to 3 centuries, many Christians compiled lists of books that they deemed canonical, or in their writings they will quote those books too, including people like Justin Martyr. He was a 2nd century Christian. There's also this document called the Muratorian Fragment, right? That also had a list of books. And then there was this Christian named Origen in the 3rd century. I think he lived in Caesarea. They all eventually came up with these lists. Now, eventually, the earliest list that has all 27 of the New Testament books that we use today was written by Athanasius. Okay, Athanasius. He was a bishop, and he wrote a letter in 367. And that's the first written record that we have where all 27 books of the New Testament is in one place. But I would say in these previous lists, right? You can look into charts. Actually, I brought one of my charts here. You could look into charts of which books were in what lists. Okay, you could pass this around, right? So many of them actually already had early consensus. Okay, many of them already had early consensus. And again, this 27 that it seems to appear quite late, but again, that's in the written record, the earliest one that we can see. But again, a lot of them had early consensus already. Okay? It's just some of the later books, like Revelation even, right? People were just wondering, should we put this in or not? Things like that, right? Okay, and then later there was a formal acceptance of these 27 books in a council of Hippo, right? Hippo was a place, I think is North Africa, right? And then the Council of Carthage. Carthage is also in North Africa. In those councils, they kind of formally accepted these 27 books. Okay, so that's the history that we know about. And these were essentially the main criteria that these Christians were using. First is they really cared about if this book had apostolic origin. Right? Since Jesus hand-selected the 12, and they were to be the eyewitnesses of Jesus and his ministry, they really cared if the author was an apostle or at least a very close co-worker of the apostles. Right? So, like in, I think, late first century, okay? Late first century to like early second century, eventually there's some writings, they're like, hey, the Gospel of Mark, should that be authoritative? And then there was this guy named Papias, right? And then he's like, Mark, he got this information from Peter, right? When you read the book of Mark, it's kind of, I learned about this later, and then when I was reading Mark again, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? There's some parts in Mark when it has to do with Peter, and you compare it to the other Gospels, it's a little less harsh on Peter than the other Gospels. Okay, yeah, right. Yeah, so Papias was saying, no, Mark should be in there because he was a close associate, a close worker of Peter, and also we also know he worked with Paul, right? So apostolic origin was something that they really cared about. Obviously, another thing is what we call orthodoxy, aligned with the doctrines and theology of the early church. And then there needed to be widespread acceptance by the various Christian communities across all the different regions. Okay, so if you look at that chart, there are some like other writings that you maybe never heard about. And then some of them maybe were read in certain places, but not read in all of Christianity. So some of them eventually did not make the canon, right? Okay, so these were some of the main criteria why eventually these were the 27. Okay, so we mentioned a few minutes ago that when Jesus was alive on this earth, he already authorized, in a sense, the Old Testament canon, right? He mentioned the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, which are written concerning him. So if we believe in Jesus, obviously we should have no doubt about the Old Testament, right? Because he said, at least in Luke, all right, this is what testifies concerning me. But a question that then we should think about is, well, who authorized this list of 27, right? And that might be a question you might have thought of before too, right? And to put it into other words, like, do we accept these 27 books simply because there was a council in the late 4th century that said, hey, these are the books, right? And we also share, too, how by the 2nd century AD, the Holy Spirit had left the church, right? Like, many doctrines were already starting to be twisted, like including baptism. It's also clear in some parts of the Christian world, they did not pray with the Holy Spirit speaking in tongues anymore by 2nd century. Right? There's a guy named Montanus. You could read about him. Right? So by 2nd century, we can already see doctrines that are being twisted. And now you fast forward 2 more centuries, and then so some of our TJC members might be questioning, like, so why do we accept this, which was made, when even more heresy maybe was already creeping into the church? Okay. It's a very legitimate question, right? Very legitimate question. But in the end, what I'm going to say may be hard for people to accept right now. But this, if you think about it, is how we know these 27 are true and is the revelation of God. The existence of the true Jesus Church today in these end times, right, which is the restoration of the apostolic church, right? the existence of the True Jesus Church, which is the same body that's described in the Bible, especially in the book of Acts. The existence of this True Jesus Church in the end times is what proves to us that this is real, right? This is, even though, yes, it went through some human decisions and there's a history, we have to view this Bible also with faith, right? There's a faith that we need. And the existence of the True Jesus Church really, if you think about it, authorizes how these 27 books are true, okay? Does that make sense to you? Does that ring a bell? I mean, not ring a bell, but does that make sense? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, there is the history, and then like, oh, the earliest was 367 and all that. But we have to also believe, even though some parts of the church was already corrupted, but part of God's salvation plan, he did preserve some things. He did preserve some things. And even though there are some outsiders, right? They're still Christians, but outsiders, they actually still did very meaningful things concerning the Bible and to preserve it. Even today, we are benefiting from the work of other Christians who are not in the True Jesus Church, right? All these translations, all those Bible tools, like people spend their whole life researching and studying this. Like, yeah, so God can also use things from other places to build up his true church. Just like how the Holy Temple of Solomon, where did the material come from? Where did the labor come from? Actually, some of the labor, some of the materials came from foreign nations, right? Okay, so it's kind of similar in that analogy. Okay, there's one true church, very clear in the Bible, right? But how God built this church, okay, of course, primarily through the Holy Spirit, but some of the building blocks, maybe, right, were from outside sources, right? Just like some of the wood and the stones and things, the labor came from foreign nations for the Holy Temple, right? Okay, any questions on that? It does also take a measure of faith to accept this. Okay, if there are no questions, we'll keep moving on to the next section. We'll talk about the divisions of the New Testament books. So here's a chart that I found online several years ago. I found it like really, really creative and also illustrative. On the left side, you see the Old Testament books, and divided into the 5 kind of typical Christian divisions that we have. And it's a little bit different from these 3, right? It's different from the 3. In the Old Testament, we usually still say this, right? Like the Torah or the Pentateuch. But then we separate out some of the books that were actually over here and then categorize it as, the history books, right? This orange here is like historical books of the Old Testament. Then we have the books of wisdom. Books of wisdom. These were, I think, all over here for the Hebrew Bible. And then we have the so-called major prophets, not because they were better than the other prophets, but because the content is longer. Lamentation is relatively shorter, but since it's attached with Jeremiah, so they just keep that together. So the major prophets, and then finally we call it the minor prophets. Okay, and this was all one book over here, right, in the prophetic section. But on the right side now, you have the New Testament. And we usually divide it into 5 sections as well. We have, the Gospels. The Gospels. So there's 4 of them. Gospels basically, literally means good news, but in terms of a literary category, refers to the books that describe the life and teachings of Jesus. Okay, then we have one historical book, the book of Acts, written like as a history. The Gospels actually are kind of history too, right? If you think about it. But they're kind of separate because it's dealing with Jesus. So in the historical section, only one book. Then we have the Pauline, I think the people say Pauline letters. 13 in all, from Romans through Philemon. The order of these books is by length. By length. So Romans is the longest. Philemon is the shortest. Right? That's how they ordered it. It's not chronological. It's by length. Approximately. Okay, approximate length. Okay, then we have what is called the general letters. The general letters from Hebrews through Jude. 8 in total. And another way that people call these general letters is called the Catholic letters. Okay. But you have to understand the word Catholic the word itself. Does anybody know what Catholic means, the word itself? Ethan. Yeah, okay. So it means universal. So that's why these are like general letters for it doesn't seem to be addressed to anybody specifically, although there are, I think 3rd John is though, okay. But the most of them are just kind of generally for the church. It's not for a specific church like Romans is or like Corinthians is. So some people say Catholic because it has a universal audience, at least at the time of writing. Okay, and then finally we have the prophetic books, and then in the New Testament it's just one. It's Revelation. Okay. Okay, yep. All right. So I've summarized these categories on this next slide. This you probably learned before in RE class. But there's 3 that I also want to highlight, 3 other kind of smaller categorizations that we want to highlight. The first is called the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels. Synoptic. So this comes from Greek, right? And syn with a Y, it basically means like together, right? It has that type of meaning. So what the synoptic gospels mean as a term are the 3 gospels that look very similar together. Okay, look very similar. For Paul's letters, sometimes 4 of them are also especially kind of sectioned out called the prison letters. This was when Paul was in prison in Rome, as described in Acts chapter 28. Right? He was in house arrest, and during that time, he was in prison, and he was able to write these epistles to edify the church. Right? These four: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And then later on, I think not too long ago, maybe only 200-300 years ago, right? And that's not too long ago in terms of Christian history. There were some, I think, theologians that also separated out 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and they call it the pastoral letters because they were young preachers, they were young pastors guiding the church, and these were the three of apart from Philemon, these were three of Paul's letters that were addressed specifically to individuals. And he calls Timothy and Titus both like my son, right? My son. Okay, so please also take note of those divisions. Any questions? Okay, let's now go to the final, I think, drier part of this class, but I hope it will be useful. We want to now talk about the transmission of the New Testament. Transmission, I mean like the copying and the process in how, the Bible came to be over history, over the time. Okay. We know that in ancient times, documents, they had to be copied by hand. When was the printing press invented? When was the printing press invented? You got to recall history. Aaron, when is the printing press? 1840? No, too late. Okay. Nathaniel, when was the printing press invented? 1400s. Good. And did you just guess? Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. And who's the inventor, or that people usually say? Aris. Chinese guy? No, I think usually they don't say a Chinese guy. Yeah, it's a European guy. I think he's a German guy. Okay, somebody said, yeah. Who is he? Gutenberg. Yeah, Gutenberg. Right. Gutenberg. I don't know German, but I think this means good. And Berg means mountain. Okay. Yeah. Huh? Yes. So the first, my understanding too, I'm not a historian, but the first thing that was ever printed in a printing press was Bibles, Greek Bibles, right? Okay. But before, and I believe this is around like 1453 or something. Right, let's verify that. When was the printing press invented? Oh, okay, 1436. According to Wikipedia, right? Okay, 1436, right? Okay. So before that, people had to copy by hand. And so people would copy different texts. But regarding the Bible and regarding the New Testament, we can find New Testament verses on these type of materials today. Right? Some people etched it into stone. Some people copied verses onto clay, pottery. But the ones that we should especially be familiar with are the next two. Okay? One is called papyrus. Papyrus. was papyrus invented? Egypt. Okay, yes, very good. And I remember seeing, see if I can bring it up real quick. Okay, no. I can show it maybe tomorrow. I went to Egypt many years ago, and then there was a lady that was introducing how papyrus was made back then, right? But it's basically the predecessor to modern paper. It's made from a papyrus reed that grows in the Nile River. You know, before Cerritos Church was renovated, in the front by the sign, there were also papyrus reeds. Right? When you cut a papyrus, the cross section, it looks like a triangle. It looks like a triangle. And then you could pull strips from that, and then eventually kind of interweave it, and then press it for many days, and they eventually become like something you can write on. So papyrus is something you should be familiar with. Another one is parchment. Parchment is made from animal hide. Okay, animal hide. They would, of course, skin the animal, like goat or maybe cow, and then use this scraper to scrape off all the like fur and all that stuff, and then dry it. It'll be a very durable type of writing surface. And something related to that one is called a palimpsest. Palimpsest. This is basically parchment, okay? It's just that due to the scarcity of materials in ancient times, sometimes you can find Bibles that were copied on palimpsest, which is they scraped off whatever was on that parchment before and wrote over it. Okay, they just wrote over it. They try to scrape as much as was previous and then just wrote over it. All right. And the major forms of the writing were two. Or obviously, if it's like stone or clay, it could be something else. But the major ones were scroll and what we call a codex, the predecessor to the modern day book. Okay. And when it comes to how they were copied, right, it was copied in Greek. Eventually, in like all capitals, like I was saying, and then lowercase, like minuscules. Okay, I showed this before, so I'll skip that. So this is what I was showing last class. This is called majuscule, right? It's all capital Greek letters. This is the Codex Sinaiticus. And what we can see here is there's no spacing. There's also no punctuation, basically, right? This is much later. This is when it was written in like lowercase, and there is, I think, more punctuation, right? So you might be thinking like, wait a second, how come they wrote it like this? This is something that people call scriptio continua, continuous script, right? Continuous script. Ancient scribes wrote without spaces between words or sentences. And it was only until the 8th century that we see more punctuation. Right? Otherwise, it was very sporadic. For us in English, we might be thinking like, that's really weird. Something like this. Right? What do you see here? Okay, Leo, what do you see here? Okay, God is now here. Okay, but what else do you see here? God is nowhere, right? So it's ambiguous if you write English like this. But in Greek, not that many ambiguities would occur that often in Greek. Why? Because with very few exceptions, native Greek words can only end in a vowel or one of three consonants: a nu, a p, and a sigma. Right? Modern day N, P, and S. So for the ancient reader, when they were reading scriptural continua, they would get the hang of it very quickly, right? The end of a word is either a vowel or one of these three consonants. And then also in ancient times, we have to understand reading silently was not what they did. Like today we read silently. But back then, they would read out loud. And when you're reading out loud, scriptural continua, actually it helps you to parse the words more systematically, right? Okay. Yeah, this is So despite the absence of spaces between words, by pronouncing to oneself what was read, syllable by syllable, one soon became used to reading scriptural continua, right? So that was a feature of many of the ancient manuscripts, okay, of how the Bible was copied. All right, we'll pick this up here tomorrow morning. Any questions? Tomorrow, after we finish this section, then we'll get into some of the theological overview of the 27 books in the New Testament. Please continue to do your structure and outlining and reviewing, at least on a high level, the content of the New Testament books. Okay, let's bow our heads and pray in silence.